Michael Bérubé has a very long and distinguished resume, and I'm not about to repeat it in detail here. I will say that he is the Paterno Family Professor in Literature at the Pennsylvania State University, where he holds appointments in the Department of English and the program in Science, Technology, and Society. He teaches courses in English, Cultural Studies, and Disability Studies. He is the author of 7 books, including his most recent, The Left at War, and a co-editor of 2 others. Known as an astute and provocative observer of higher education, Michael also serves on the National Council of the AAUP. His work has appeared in numerous academic journals and more popular journals such as Harper's, The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Washington Post, and The Nation. And if you are an avid watcher of Mad Men, as I am, you may want to read his blog as well. It's my pleasure to present Professor Michael Bérubé.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out. It's an honor, and I'm thrilled to be part of this celebration. I'm getting the sense you don't do this all the time. And that's got to be the first introduction that ever mentioned Mad Men. So let me throw up on that for a moment. One of the reasons I'm as fascinated with that show as I am is that I almost went into advertising. I did an internship as an undergraduate, and I decided that even though it might involve making a pile of money before I was 30, that over the long run it would not be a fulfilling career, only to find out that in academia sometimes I find myself in the position of pitchman anyway. In that essay about the utility of the arts and humanities, I retell the story of being convened to a meeting with the university president of Illinois. Back then it was James Stuckel. And he wanted to know how the university could handle the deregulation of higher education, by which he meant new technologies, by which he meant computers, online education. And I said, you know, deregulation is a funny thing. You know, it has some benefits, but also some unseen side effects. And you might want also to take a look at this thing the student newspaper publishes. It's called the Incomplete List of Faculty Ranked as Excellent by their students. Who do you think dominated that list? The arts and the humanities. Courses with small student-faculty ratios, studio classes in trumpet, writing seminars. I said, you could take that anywhere. You could take that to students, to legislators, and say, you know what, we have an enormous multiversity here at Illinois, but it also contains like 40 Oberlins. You know, these little places that we really do run like a liberal arts college within the university. And Stuckel looked at me and said, yeah, it's nice to think about the warm and fuzzies. And I tell that story all the time now. A, I can't believe you said that. B, I can't believe you said it to me, because you should know me. I'm going to repeat that all the time. Just, so I feel like here I was, doing this pitch, for whatever, Life Cereal or, small liberal arts colleges, and just being shot down by the client. Unfortunately, the client was the university president. So yeah, at Penn State, I haven't had that experience. Excuse me. But as I say, it's an honor to be here, and congratulations on the 75th. My wife and I just celebrated our 25th, so we're not going to catch the Sorbonne either. But, it's a big month. Okay. In February 2009, as the magnitude of the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008 was becoming chillingly clear, the New York Times ran a story headlined, "In Tough Times, the Humanities Must Justify Their Worth." If for some reason you didn't have a chance to read that then, don't worry, it will come back. I remember, in fact, the exact same essay being published 10 years earlier in the New York Times, quoting the exact same people, only then the headline was, "In flush times, the humanities must justify their worth." Because, in 1999, right, we were in the middle of a robustly globalizing economy and a vertiginous dot-com boom. Who in their right mind would major in the liberal arts at a time like that? And now that the people in the advanced financial sector of that globalizing economy have plunged us all into a great recession, somehow the humanities have to justify their worth. All right. I have the distinct feeling, though, that, as absurd as this sounds, it's going to be a permanent feature of the landscape in American higher education. You'll see in the course of this morning's talk, I'm going to speak more about the recent past than about the immediate future, but that's because I think one is connected to the other. But I also think the recent past is going to set the terms for what the next couple of decades are going to be looking like. I mean, let's put it this way. 20 years from now, when we are living in utopia, it'll be great. There's going to be 100% employment. There will be limitless, clean, renewable energy. The world will be at peace. There will be a children's theme park located at the symbolic and cheerful border of Israel and the Republic of Palestine. And we will still be asking ourselves, even then, can the humanities be justified in times like these? And the truly weird thing about the Times essay back in 2009 was that even as it speaks of declining enrollments in the humanities, and on that one, just don't even get me started. I could do a whole morning just on that. Even Frank Donahue, the author of that Chronicle piece from 2 weeks ago, falls into this. We have enrollments have declined since 1970. 1970 was an anomalous high watermark. That's like, well, we've declined since Everest. In English, we accounted for 4% of all BAs in 1950. We account for about 4% of all BAs now. We accounted for 7.6% in 1970. It spiked in the late 60s. Nobody knows why. The draft, more women in college, the expansion post-GI Bill to new populations, no idea. And then it plummeted to 3.5 by 1980. That pattern was replicated throughout the humanities and the social sciences. It's not a long, slow bleed. It's a sort of, but mostly hovering at around 4% in English. No real serious enrollment decline over the long term. But, like I say, the Times still speaks of declining enrollments in the humanities, admitting that enrollments have held steady over the last 10 years, and that, quote, the humanities continue to thrive in elite liberal arts schools. Might it not be the case that people go to elite liberal arts schools precisely for that reason? I'm trying to imagine a scenario in which commentators on higher education note with surprise that the sciences are thriving at MIT. I mean, okay, now I'm going to do a series of reductions here. One, I know the liberal arts are not, I'm speaking to a College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, okay? And how things are divvied up on campus to campus can matter a great deal, not only for the organizational chart, but for the actual intellectual content and the contours of the work that gets done. So I know liberal arts are not made up entirely of the disciplines of the humanities. The liberal arts education, as I see it, must also include training in the physical and social sciences. Otherwise, who knows? You'd wind up with a nation of adults who don't understand economics or evolution. Sorry, I can't even finish that sentence. For the purposes of this talk, however, I'm going to focus exclusively on the humanities. My remarks will center, I hope justifiably, on my own discipline of literary studies and its various correspondences with philosophy over the years, partly because we've often served so aggressively as the clearinghouse for interdisciplinarity in the humanities, and, not coincidentally, as one of the softest targets in the academic culture wars. So, I'm going to start by calling attention to some of the language of the letter I received as part of my invitation to this event, because I think this crystallizes just why we have found it so hard to make a compelling public case for the vital importance of the humanities. A traditional liberal arts education, read the letter, has theoretically affirmed the belief in the existence of a certain kind of knowledge or wisdom, as opposed to information or content, that is timeless and universally valuable to the human spirit. Okay, I think that's right. Traditionally, this is very much the kind of thing we used to say. There is a certain kind of knowledge or wisdom that is timeless and universally valuable to the human spirit, and we have access to it. Come take our classes, and you can have access to it as well. That, go back to Mad Men, was a good sales pitch. Timeless, universally valuable knowledge and wisdom are us. The problem, right, is that we don't make this pitch anymore. Right, Gail wrote to me and said, I want to make it clear I don't believe that. I said, well, that's my point. Exactly, we don't believe that. We don't believe in good conscience that we can make that pitch. We don't believe that knowledge is timeless, for one thing. And we don't believe that anything is universally valuable either. We still believe in wisdom, I think. But you're not going to catch us saying anything about the human spirit, because that would be homogenizing and essentializing and also mystifying, and who wants that? So for the next few minutes, I'm going to try to explain how things got that way. I'll breeze over the last couple decades of literary and cultural theory, and though I will be brief, I will try to be judicious. Then I'll make some suggestions about what kind of sales pitch we might want to make instead, and how we might go about justifying an enterprise that offers a form of knowledge and wisdom that is neither timeless nor universally valuable. The shortest explanation for our aversion to talk about timelessness and universality is that we are all Heracliteans now. Heraclitus, you will recall, was the pre-Socratic gadfly who went about Ephesius telling people that everything changes except the law that everything changes, and you cannot step in the same river twice. These days, we are more likely to quote Barbara Herrnstein Smith on the contingencies of value, or Frederick Jameson on the imperative to historicize, but it's more or less the same ever-changing river we're talking about. Nothing is timeless or universal about human knowledge. All is time-bound, contingent, partial. Indeed, and here's the second part, the attempt to represent a form of knowledge as timeless or universal is inevitably an ideological move, an attempt to represent a part for the whole, to claim that the intellectual folkways of one tribe are in fact models for the entire species everywhere on the globe. It's that imperializing gesture, that very claim to universality, that makes the Enlightenment look bad in retrospect, because it is what allowed some very bright white guys to talk about universal principles while denying that those principles applied to women or Africans. That critique of the Enlightenment, needless to say, had to happen, for pretty much the same reason that Thurgood Marshall's famous critique of the Constitution as a flawed document had to happen, which is actually part and parcel of the critique of the Enlightenment. One does not want to paper over the contradictions involved here, or to dismiss the question of how a slaveholder could write that all men are created equal and are endowed with inalienable rights by saying, well, everybody did that back then. Far better to face that past honestly, I think, however discomforting it may be. But the critical question, both for contemporary theory and for political practice, is whether the ideals of the Enlightenment, one of which was the belief in the universal rights of humankind, were fundamentally sound and merely needed revision over the past 2 centuries, or whether they were rotten root and branch and will always lead to fatal contradictions and pernicious exclusions. Okay, before I get to that question, a bit of more recent history. Barbara Herrnstein Smith's Contingencies of Value was widely misinterpreted in the public press and in general intellectual journals when it was published in 1988. Commentators accused her of relativism, of arguing basically that the process of evaluation, whether in aesthetics, morals, or any other realm, was completely arbitrary. Poet and critic David Lehman complained that Smith's book jettisoned 2 centuries of aesthetic theory, as if that was some kind of capital offense. I mean, really, only 2 centuries? Why not take the long view here? What's the big deal? Now, it's true, because Smith's was an anti-Kantian book, no question about it, but she did not argue that evaluation was arbitrary and therefore pointless. Quite the contrary. She argued that evaluation is contingent and therefore inescapable. We do it all the time. And I actually have a feature on my blog, which I'm actually running out of the energy to keep up, but started some years ago, called Arbitrary But Fun Fridays, where people make value judgments and then defend them in the comments. Point being that they're not really arbitrary. They're motivated in various ways, and we argue about them all the time, but it's also fun. Contingent is not the same thing as arbitrary, though. It suggests that nothing more than the uncontroversial claim that value is radically dependent on context. Value is not intrinsic. It is always value toward an end, for some purpose or goal. That's the anti-Kantian part. So I say this is controversial because we all know that it's part of folk wisdom. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. There is no accounting for taste. To each his own. But it does have some unsettling corollaries, including the claim that human rights are neither intrinsic nor inalienable. They too are contingent. They too will change. They have changed, along with everything else we humans have done. We have largely stopped talking, and it's a good thing too, about the great chain of being or the divine right of kings. Right? We speak instead of the human rights, universal human rights enshrined in the UN Declaration of 1948. We don't actually realize them, but we talk in that language. But today we also speak of the rights of animals, which is something we didn't do before, because our understanding of what a rights-bearing entity is and what a right is subject to that unchanging law that everything changes. But Smith's book, by the way, one quick aside, I get this question all the time about my younger son who has Down syndrome, when I talk about how Down syndrome is both a brute fact and a social fact. It's a biochemical event, it's a chromosomal non-disjunction, and of course, so therefore it resides in the realm of science. But of course, also at the same time, the policies of early intervention and full inclusion have changed the lives of people with Down syndrome immeasurably over the last 40, 50 years, and so it is also very much a social fact. And it makes my case, I think, that social facts help constitute what brute facts are. It also makes the case that rights change over time, and what those rights are construed to be changes the actual lives of the humans they administer. And people say, yeah, but if you were the last person on earth who believed in the human rights of your child and you died, would he still have those human rights? This is a classic, human rights falling in the forest kind of question. And my pragmatic answer is, it does Jamie and everyone else like him a fat lot of good to have rights that no one recognizes. I don't even know what that means. What, they exist in the ether? If they're not realized, if they're not put into practice, they do not exist. That's a pragmatic claim, not a terribly metaphysical one, and I don't think it is relativist. I think it's actually kind of realist. But Smith's book was not the only thing that stirred the pot in what has since become to be known as the political correctness kerfuffle of the early 90s. There was also Judith Butler's gender trouble, which caused all kinds of trouble, and Eve Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet. This was Queer Theory's Annus Mirabilis of 1990. And anyone who thinks that the conservative backlash against so-called PC didn't have a great deal to do with what Michael Warner called the fear of a queer planet is fooling herself. One need only point to new Criterion editor Roger Kimball's insistence that, quote, homosexual themes, close quote, are not, quote, appropriate subjects for a public scholarly discussion of literature. Man, that leaves out a lot of stuff. I pointed to this almost 20 years ago, but it's one of these remarks that just gets more revealing with time. I could also direct your attention to U.S. News and World Report columnist John Leo's mockery of the transgender dorm and the queer prom at his daughter's place, Wesleyan University, 15 years later in 2005. But you get the point. These boys have issues. Queer theorists had and still have good reason to suspect that much resistance to their work is grounded in rank homophobia. And the need to defend queer theory from rank homophobes obscured for some years another kind of trouble with the queer project, its rejection of the rhetoric of the universal. Rejection is maybe too strong a word because things weren't quite so simple. But certainly, few academic humanists in the 1990s felt comfortable handling the term universal without first donning protective outer gear. Take, for example, this difficult passage in Butler's essay, For a Careful Reading. This is her testy response to Salah Ben Habib in the collection Feminist Contentions. Quote, what one means by the universal will vary, and the cultural articulation of the term in its various modalities will work against precisely the transcultural status of the claim. This is not to say that there ought to be no reference to the universal or that it has become for us an impossibility. On the contrary. All this means is that there are cultural conditions for articulation which are not always the same, and the term gains its meaning for us precisely through the decidedly less than universal cultural conditions of its articulation. This is a paradox that any injunction to adopt a universal attitude will encounter. Close quote. The reason I call this a difficult passage, quite apart from the fact that it's a difficult passage, is that it seems almost to be wrestling with itself. On the one hand, the universal is decidedly not universal. To each his own universal, modulated through these various cultural articulations. And yet the universal is not impossible. On the contrary, Butler writes, well, what is the contrary of the impossible? You know, the merely possible? Is it that the universal has only now become possible? Or maybe the universal has become for us a necessity, even though it gains its meaning only through the less than universal cultural conditions of its articulation. Okay, as if that weren't muddying enough, the next paragraph clarifies things and then muddies them further. Quote, it may be that in one culture, a set of rights are considered to be universally endowed, and that in another, those very rights mark the limit to universality, i.e., if we grant those people these rights, we will be undercutting the foundations of the universal as we know it. This has become especially clear to me in the field of lesbian and gay human rights, where the universal is a contested term, and where various cultures and various mainstream human rights groups voice doubt over whether lesbian and gay humans ought properly to be included in the human, and whether their putative rights fit within the existing conventions governing the scope of rights considered universal. Close quote. Okay. Here, first, Butler, gotta say, scores a hit, a very palpable hit. She is referring not only to the homophobic fear that gay marriage will undermine the institution of marriage, and of course will annul my 25 years, but also to the sorry fact that for many years, Amnesty International, she doesn't name them, but she's looking their way, did not consider crimes against gays and lesbians to be crimes against human rights in their assessments of freedom around the globe. Though Amnesty International now emphatically considers gay rights to be human rights, we seem to have produced another queer paradox, where some gay and lesbian activists in the West are now hesitant to condemn the persecution of gays and lesbians in Iran, for example, on the grounds that to do so would be to engage in cultural imperialism. But what Butler is doing here, I think, is rather different from what she was doing back when she insisted that the universal is always culturally articulated. In noting that the universal is withheld from certain groups, she's complaining rightly that a putative universal is not universal enough. Right? What we need then is not a culturally contingent sense of the universal, but a really, truly universal. And then the argument takes one last turn. It may be, Butler writes in the next paragraph, that the universal is only partially articulated and that we do not yet know what form it will take. In this sense, the contingent and cultural character of the existing conventions governing the scope of universality does not deny the usefulness or importance of the term universal. It simply means that the claim of universality has not yet received a full or final articulation, that it remains to be seen how and whether it will be articulated further. Okay. To that, I can only say, well, what did you expect? Of course the universal may be defined differently in the future. And of course we don't know what form it will take. I'm tempted here to do a bit from the beginning of Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space. You, my friends, we are all interested in the future, for that is where we will spend the rest of our lives. Or Yogi Berra, right? It's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. The idea, right, that the universal could ever achieve a full and final articulation, what does that mean? It seems to me nonsensical. You have to imagine a future world in which all humans agree on the meaning of the term universal, and we all congratulate each other on finally getting that settled. And when you put it that way, it sounds kind of silly. But strange as it may sound, one of the leading contemporary theorists and defenders of the Enlightenment did put it that way. Jürgen Habermas was the bête noire of the academic left in the 1980s and 90s, even though he was a man of the left, not merely because he called Foucault and Derrida young conservatives in the course of defending the project of modernity, that is, Enlightenment, but especially because he construed the ideal speech situation as free from domination, that would be good, and oriented toward consensus, and that would be bad. Why? Well, because Jean-François Lyotard's reply that consensus is terror was no doubt hyperbolic, but surely there were, and there still are, very good reasons to object to a theory of communication that takes consensus as its a priori goal. As I noted in What's Liberal About the Liberal Arts, 2006 book, my graduate students have all learned to reject Habermas and embrace his critics, whereas my undergraduates don't see anything wrong with the idea that people should try to communicate in order to achieve reciprocal recognition and consensus. And I always wonder what's going on with my graduates. How did my graduate students, how did my entire discipline achieve a consensus? The consensus was terror. It's Monty Python's world. We're just living in it. The point needs to be made, right, that reciprocal recognition is not the same thing as consensus. I can understand you, or try to, without agreeing with what you say. And the point needs to be made that establishing consensus as the orientation of communication really is coercive. It's like imagining all of culture and society as if it were jury duty, and political debate as juror deliberation. We don't get to go home, right, until we achieve our full and final articulation. There are other problems with Habermas, too. His emphasis on reason has seemed to some critics, especially feminists, to set emotion and affect at a discount, though one can plausibly counter-argue, as my friend Amanda Anderson has done, that there are a variety of ways to understand and achieve reciprocal recognition, and not all of them depend exclusively on reason. But I think, in the end, it's better to conceive of Enlightenment universalism as an incomplete project than to dismiss it altogether. Or to claim, as Lyotard did, that the Enlightenment leads directly to the Holocaust. That seems to me another kind of hyperbolic claim. There was also a whole bunch of blood and soil dark romanticism involved there as well. And the reason I think so has everything to do with my reading of Butler's critique of universalism. That critique, Butler's I mean, launches three ultimately incompatible claims. One, the universal gains its meaning from decidedly less than universal cultural conditions of its articulation. Two, that some claims to universality are partial and exclusionary and need to be more universal. Three, the universal has not achieved its full and final articulation. First two claims are in tension with one another, and the first, I think, may in fact undercut the second. You know, if it's always partial, then how can you ask for a more universal universalism? All right? But the third claim is the one I want to focus on, because it suggests that the universal can always be called to account, can always be called into question. Universalism in these terms seems attractive to me precisely because it announces a promise whose fulfillment is never fully and finally achieved. This is what I think we're after, what I'm after in the liberal arts. It does not dictate norms. It does not promise equality or sameness, and it does not premise equality on sameness. But it does say that you can always debate whether a universalist principle is really sufficiently universal. I'll take a very vivid example from me. The promise announced by universalism is what motivates Eva Cattay's disability rights critique of the social contract tradition from John Locke to John Rawls. Cattay's argument in her book Love's Labor, which is picked up and elaborated in Martha Nussbaum's book Frontiers of Justice, is that the idea of the social contract in which, quote, free, equal, and independent parties quote, form societies for mutual advantage. And also in John Rawls' term, they establish the principles of justice from behind a veil of ignorance so as not to tilt the scales to their own benefit. That social contract tradition, says Kitay, will always exclude people with significant intellectual disabilities, who are not free, equal, and independent parties, and cannot offer their fellow citizens the possibility of mutual advantage. Now, Rawls addresses disability in what he calls the legislative phase of the deliberations over justice, but Kitay and Nussbaum are right to see that the exclusion of people with intellectual disabilities from the foundations of justice is intrinsic to the social contract tradition. As we say on the internets, it's not a feature. It's a feature of the system, not a bug. Man, blew that one. Thus, even Rawls's aspiration to a universal theory of justice, in which, for example, the Rawlsian difference principle permits inequalities in the distribution of goods only if those inequalities benefit the least well off. I mean, that's pretty good. Most people in the US, if they're on the left, they take that and go home. Punch out, we're done. But even by this critique, that principle is weighed in the scales of justice and found wanting because its form of universalism is not universalist enough. And only a universalist theory is open to that kind of critique. That's my point. You can't possibly go up and plausibly critique the theory of the divine right of kings or the great chain of being for being exclusionary or hierarchical. They're meant to be. If, however, you advance a principle as universalist, a principle that makes that open-ended promise, you are obliged to admit all comers and take on all challenges from anyone and everyone who believes that your claim to universalism isn't sufficiently universal. So that briefly is why, ultimately, I'm with Habermas on this in the belief that modernity is an incomplete project. But I can't tell the story of how things got this way in the humanities without trying to account for that widespread rejection of Habermas in my discipline. As my colleague John McGowan wrote 5 years ago, there is evidence of groupthink out there. Let me give an example, he writes, that bugged me for years. For a long time, happily that time now seems over, lots of people in literary studies knew that if Habermas said it, it must be wrong. The man couldn't get a fair hearing in certain circles. The reasons for this failure in open-mindedness are many and complex, but we should certainly not discount the bad effects of a lousy job market and the increasing pressure to publish. Conformity will result when it is very hard to get or to keep a place at the theory's empire table. Now, I'm going to dissociate myself with the last part of that because I think you could also have a tight job market in which everyone agreed with Habermas, and there's a different kind of conformity. Also, I think the if Habermas said it, it must be wrong era isn't really quite over, as evidenced by the response of the theory crowd to what's liberal about the liberal arts. That response went something like this. Quote, it's all very well and good for Bérubé to talk about the separation of powers and the relative autonomy of civil society as forms of liberalism, but everyone knows that liberalism is really just a stalking horse for the imperialist Enlightenment project of universal reason and also cannot account for its imbrication in the system of power knowledge. People can write this stuff in their sleep, and some actually do. But I don't think they do it just to keep a place at the theory table. I think they actually believe it, right? One of the more substantial reasons why people believe that if Habermas said it, it must be wrong, is that his most fierce critic, Lyotard, framed his attack as a defense of the avant-garde. For Lyotard, what gets lost in the Habermasian world of communicative reason is all the bizarre, experimental, God knows what stuff produced by the various avant-gardes of the past 200 years. You know, the cranks and sages speaking a language no one else understands and imagining worlds other than this one. Well, who else should rally to the defense of the avant-garde but artists and humanists? Who else is going to do it? I recently had an email exchange with a journalist, a fairly prominent person, who complained to me that the sorry state of the humanities has everything to do with literary theorists and their fascination with transgression. You know what I replied? The really appalling thing is that literature itself so often traffics in transgression. It's not us. I mean, since Romanticism, the Czech theorist Jan Mukwirowski pointed this out 70 years ago. Since Romanticism, the transgression of the aesthetic and cultural norm has been the dominant norm in art and literature. If you want to go back before the Romantics, oh, there can be transgression aplenty in Greek drama. You should keep your eye on this trendy Sophocles guy. Some of his plays might be influential someday. Defenses of the avant-garde, the transgressive, the Gothic, the sublime. These will, I hope, always be part of the stock-in-trade of the liberal arts, and it should be no surprise that Lyotard would get a sympathetic hearing from that quarter. So, in good Habermasian fashion, I do try to understand criticisms of Habermas as something other than shallow careerist pledges of allegiance. That said, Some criticisms of Habemas do strike me as shallow careerist pledges of allegiance. Take this defense of Slavoj Žižek by a young professor of philosophy. This was reprinted in the Chronicle of Higher Education. He was championing Žižek's support for revolution and for what many people would call totalitarianism. This professor, who goes by the Lacanian nom de blague Saint-Thomé, writes, quote, "Under this neo-pragmatic liberal democratism, any form of engagement envisioning an alternative form of society is excluded a priori as necessarily doomed to produce disaster and simultaneously as impossible. There is thus a closure of political possibility, and the best we can hope for is a pacifying, communicative action that dare not work for something else." Close quote. So note that swipe at Habermas's communicative action there. The idea is that trying to understand each other is a petty bourgeois, neo-pragmatic, neoliberal enterprise. That would be bad. Whereas forms of engagement that envision an alternative form of society are radical and possibly even wicked cool. Now, I don't want to rehearse here the debate about whether philosophers with brilliant, sweeping critiques of the liberal West are especially susceptible to enthusiasm for brutally illiberal forms of government, though if you want to take that up in the Q&A, I will. But I will admit that when I read these dismissals of liberal democratism and utopian longings for alternative forms of society, that argument does come to mind. As I note in The Left at War, when Žižek was asked by Ernesto Laclau just what his alternative form of society might look like, Žižek's answer was remarkable for its refusal to answer. Dismissing, quote, today's liberal blackmail that according any prospect of radical change paves the way for totalitarianism, Žižek wrote, "It is my firm conviction, my politico-existential premise, that the old 68 motto, soyons réalistes, demandons l'impossible, still holds. Be realistic, demand the impossible." As a political platform, surely this leaves much to be desired. And surely that's precisely its point, to leave everything to desire. Note also Saint-Thomé's charge that communicative action is pacifying. The idea apparently is that embarking on a universalist, Enlightenment-inspired project to combat distorted communication and foster reciprocal recognition will de-radicalize us, if not lobotomize us. And I always ask, how in the world do people teach this? I want you not to understand me. Okay. And for much of the past 3 decades, the idea has been widespread enough among academic humanists to produce an entertaining paradox. Like I said, an intellectual coterie whose members are in almost unanimous consensus that consensus is a bad thing. But some consequences of that anti-consensus consensus are not nearly so entertaining. As I've noted many times before, the ideal of dissensus has been taken up in the humanities as if it were a matter of preserving species diversity. And Lyotard's spirited defense of the heterogeneity of language games has been universally understood as a defense of the marginal, the oppressed, the downtrodden, the wretched of the earth. In fact, however, calling for 1,000 heterogeneous language games to bloom is actually morally neutral and can easily lead to quietism. Also, relatedly, sweeping critiques of so-called Western rationality have turned out to be exceptionally congenial to climate change denialists and demagogues who want to teach our children that Adam and Eve rode dinosaurs to church. I want to be clear about what I'm not saying on this count. And so now I'm bringing out the heavy artillery. I am not trotting out the tiresome charge that relativism is self-refuting, nor am I suggesting that theorists are patsies for totalitarians. I am simply arguing that the critique of the Enlightenment was necessary because the Enlightenment's claims to universalism were themselves partial and incomplete, but that the wholesale rejection of the Enlightenment has led to intellectual paradoxes and political pitfalls. Finally, I'm not arguing that anything I have said with regard to theory and universalism, the Enlightenment and its discontents, has anything whatsoever to do with student enrollment or institutional funding in the humanities. Didn't expect a laugh on that one. Okay. It's not as if, and this is you can't say this to journalists because it takes too long, but it's not as if students would be streaming to our courses if only we gave up all this talk about the heterogeneity of language games and dwelled instead on the formal properties of Ottava Rima and the pastoral elegy. That's not really at stake in why students come to us or don't. Likewise, it's not as if taxpayers, parents, alumni, and donors are sitting out there, arms folded, and saying, I'm not going to support these professors until they start saying better things about Habermas. Nothing is more common these days, and nothing is more wearisome than to come upon requiems for the humanities that consist of idiosyncratic complaints about somebody met once, or something that bothered somebody about something. The most annoying example this season is Andrew Hacker, who was apparently disgusted that a young PhD would come to Queen's College and express an interest in publishing his scholarship, and now says, in so many written words, that writing should not be part of the job of university professors. Last year, it was William Dershowitz who blamed his training in the humanities for the fact that he could not hold a conversation with his plumber. I didn't make that up. I am beginning to suspect, in fact, that the real reason that some people no longer trust or respect humanists is that some of us write these solemn essays about how their elite educations have rendered them incapable of making small talk with plumbers. Now, a serious aside. This is the beginning of Dershowitz's essay. If your plumber is wearing a Red Sox cap and talks with a thick Boston accent, and you can't even say a few words to him about the history of the Red Sox, especially the recent history, that's not the fault of your elite education. That's just you. Now, around the same time, Dershowitz published a review essay in The Nation in which he wrote, in literary study, quote, in literary studies in particular, the last several decades have witnessed the baleful reign of theory, a mashup of Derridian deconstruction, Foucauldian social theory, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and other assorted abstrusiosities, the overall tendency of which has been to cut the field off from the society at large and from the main currents of academic thought, not to mention the common reader and common sense. Okay. Now, the claim that theory cut the field off from the main currents of academic thought is simply wrong. In fact, some people who criticize the main currents of academic thought know that. They're like, yeah, you've all been infected by theory. It's in the groundwater now. There's no getting out of it. Because theory was an interdisciplinary phenomenon. But the claim that all this theory cut the field off from common sense is even stranger. Let me explain. It reminds me of this wonderful fantasy interview with James Dobson of Focus on the Family. It was published by the comic geniuses responsible for the blog known as Fafblog. So, fantasy interview. Fafblog says, I thought gay people were good and deserved marriage licenses. Dobson, that's probably because of your treacherous liberal education. It's brainwashed you into thinking that there is no right and wrong, that everyone deserves equal rights, and that the fossil record accurately represents the geological and biological history of the Earth. If our society continues to slide down this slippery slope of moral relativism, it will mean the end of Western civilization. Fafblog, oh no, not Western civilization, that's where all my friends live. So when I hear literary theory has cut us off from common sense, that's what I say. You know, oh no, not common sense. That's where all my friends live. I mean, it's all well and good to snark at silliness like this. There was never a time when literary criticism just did common sense. I mean, I can't imagine even getting paid for that. That's pretty much the way it looks. Ahab dies. I alone have escaped to tell thee. I got nothing else. But of course the question remains, if indeed we no longer believe that there is a certain kind of knowledge or wisdom that is timeless and universally valuable to the human spirit, then what do we tell people about the value of what we do? Is it possible to make the case for the humanities and the liberal arts without going back to the bromides of the admissions brochure? Should we simply pretend the last 30 years of intellectual history didn't happen, or that it was all a wrong turn, it was a bad dream? We should take a page from the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind and expunge our awareness of the contingencies of value and the arbitrariness of the sign. 5 years ago, in one of these blog disputes with theory folk, I wondered if our critics would be satisfied if we put out a news bulletin, this just in, sign not arbitrary after all. My answer, of course, is no. For my sense is that, those cows are not going back in that barn. And I, for one, have no desire to herd them. I'm going to try instead to say that the liberal arts we now practice, the disciplines of the humanities that emphasize historical change and the contingency of value, are not only more adequate to the world we actually live in, but more exciting intellectually as well. That world is a world in which the meaning and the value of Shakespeare or Sophocles or Stephen King is not fixed once and for all, but open for debate and contestation, as they manifestly are. It's a world in which race and gender, sexuality and disability are not defined once and for all, but susceptible to slippage and performativity, as they manifestly are. Now, put this another way. It may seem to some of you that my attempt to answer the question of the value of the humanities by walking through the past few decades of theory is deliberately perverse. It may even seem to be a symptom of the problem. Humanists are called upon to speak about the social and cultural consequences of our work, and in response we mumble to each other a string of incomprehensible abstrusiosities about cryptonormativity and hybridity and the cultural construction of enunciative modalities. About the technical jargon you find in some humanities scholarship, all I can say is what Marianne Moore said about poetry. I too dislike it. And yet, reading it with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Even if it's just the genuine in scare quotes, just as Moore herself put her famous phrase, imaginary gardens with real toads in them, in scare quotes. But about the substance of our work, I have no such ambivalence. Even when I disagree with these sweeping denunciations of the Enlightenment and its legacy, I believe with all my heart that arguing about things like universalism is precisely what we're supposed to be doing. Learning and debating the history of universalist aspirations and challenges thereto, with reference to race and gender and nationality and sexuality and disability and religion. This is what gets me out of bed in the morning. And what about the recondite and the abstruse stuff? You know, scholars like Habemas and Lyotard and Foucault debating about the purposes of debate, not the kind of stuff that undergraduates can plunge right into. I know that's a difficult conversation to join. But I also think it is a path to wisdom, a form of wisdom, to a deeper understanding of human affairs. It is sometimes said that the humanities and the liberal arts teach us how to understand difference in some sort of generally tolerant way. I would like to believe this, because I would like to believe that when people begin to become acquainted with the history of human thought and the astonishing variety of the artifacts of the human imagination in every medium, they're more likely to see the world with a sense of wonder, with a livelier sense that any one of us might be wrong or only partly right, with an awareness that the world was not always thus and can be imagined otherwise, and what Buddhists call beginner's mind. But that's all merely what I like to believe. We don't have to always puncture that belief by reminding ourselves daily that the architects of the Holocaust were intelligent and cultured men. We could temper our optimism just more gently by recalling there's no way to ensure that training in the liberal arts leads to anyone's moral improvement or even to everyone's greater happiness. Sometimes knowledge comes with pain. And as for understanding difference, I am tempted to recall the exchange in Flannery O'Connor's Good Country People. Everybody is different, Mrs. Hopewell says. Yes, most people is, replies Mrs. Freeman. We all seem to wind up, do we not, with the different ways of understanding difference. But I do think the liberal arts do help us to grapple with the stubborn fact that some forms of human difference might be unresolvable, and that some kinds of conflict might in fact be intractable. That stubborn fact, no matter what form it takes, from the trivial to the critical, in one of its guises, it poses to us the question of how to develop and how to maintain pluralist societies that include people who are not pluralists. Is it right and just, then, to exclude the excluders? Or is it arrogant and imperialist to campaign for gay rights and women's rights around the globe? What are our obligations to our descendants and to our fellow species? What are the appropriate limits to prenatal screening and diagnosis and genetic therapy? Answering all those questions, or any one of them, requires extraordinary suppleness of mind and a willingness to think in ways that don't immediately reach for easy resolution. It requires what Keats called negative capability. An education in the humanities is not a guarantee or a guarantor of anything, but it may very well enhance our capacity to imagine incommensurability and to question whether the incommensurability in question really is an incommensurability or just a trivial dispute, masking a broader underlying agreement. And it may very well enhance our capacity to deal with real incommensurability when we see it. The question here is nothing less than the question of how we, individually and collectively, are to lead our lives. It's a question that has vexed us for as long as we can remember, and it is a question that can only be definitively answered by our extinction, which we may yet bring about, dragging any number of other species with us. But till then, we must make the case as forcefully as possible. The humanities are disciplines of lifelong learning, not providers of tasty desserts in a meal whose main courses consist of business administration and technology transfer. There are all too many university administrators, I mentioned one in my little intro, who see the humanities and the liberal arts as dessert, or even worse, a bitter pill. And I know it is an open question as to whether universities will continue to be places that try to foster lifelong learning. That is why it will not suffice to see the liberal arts as the studies of fine objects and timeless truths. Right? We should rather see the liberal arts as the study of what it means and has meant and might mean to be human. In a world where the human itself is a variable and challengeable term, its definition revised time and time again. We should say that what we offer is not the prospect of a better life, but the promise of an examined life. And just as the universal has not yet received a final articulation, we might say that our disciplines offer no final examination. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful talk. We have some time, and Michael has agreed to take questions. So if anyone has a question, we ask that you go up to the mic and pose your question so that everyone can hear. Helene also has a portable mic that she can take around. So let's open the floor. Mina.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Your discussion, particularly your last point, Professor Bérubé, raised the question for me of kind of how professors make universities relevant in the 21st century. There have been, I'm sure you've seen the articles written by scholars at the American Enterprise Institute and other places that a college education is no longer necessary, that there are that we need to create more professional schools, that the liberal arts education is kind of an artifact of the past. And it seems kind of a ridiculous case on the surface, but I'm just wondering how you think, since this is kind of entering the policy world, how this is addressed, particularly in an era of rising costs for higher education.
Oh yeah, rising costs. Let's see if I can deal with that last. You know, even though I had my fun with that Times essay at the very outset of my talk, of course in tough times, humanities must justify their worth, so must the liberal arts, because the pressure is overwhelming. If you've got graduates coming back to live with their parents for, 3, 4, 5 years, and Larry Summers saying the other day, well, they're not going to live with their parents forever. And the blogger Atrio says, well, they might. Then the question of what kind of employment we're talking about takes on a special urgency, right? And I don't mean to dismiss that or forestall it. My argument is pretty much the traditional argument that specific professional training, okay, that may, over short term, over the first 5, 10 years, pan out. But the X job you train for may not exist in 10 or 20 years. There may be W job and Y job and beyond zebra jobs. And the liberal arts actually trains a much more intellectually and flexible workforce than professional training does. But that's a very hard case to make when you're going through now, the second, third year of a major global recession, and unemployment is stuck officially at 10, and for you 6, something like 15, 16%. You actually would like to see, immediate university jobs program now. Even I feel that. So I think there's a question of short-term and long-term, and the other thing you have to think over the short-term and long-term is that you have to amortize. What does it mean to have this kind of student debt? It amazes me when I talked about the enrollments holding steady in English at 4%. Now we're down to I think 3.6, 3.7, not quite down to 1980 levels, but still. Think of all our students here, from their parents, from newspapers, from pretty much every source available, that ours are boutique disciplines, that they really are dessert, that they really don't have any practical function. And then they average $20,000 of debt, or like a medium-sized car at the end of 4 years. It's astonishing to me that we have as many majors as we do. I mean, that's just, all the disincentives are facing our way. All the incentives run in the other direction. Okay, so as long as we're talking, most of this time I try to sound like pragmatic, moderate, reasonable person. Let me talk like a crazy radical for a moment. Free public higher education. I mean, that kind of investment, which I think Adolph Reed estimated at something like $50, $60 billion, not a chance of passing, believe me. Not that crazy. But making that kind of investment in social capital, in human capital, seems to me a much better way to go over the long term. The debt crisis for students not only is unconscionable in and of itself, but it has been allowed to fester for so long by the privatization of the student loan industries. There's basically been a whole cadre of people making a good chunk of change off that, and I would love to see that era end, now.
Thanks, Michael. I had a question about the categories of the universal, to which you appeal in the sort of Habermasian aspects of your talk. What I'm wondering about is it just a matter of the quantitative scope that people will be debating about what the universal constitutes when they're critiquing their current social conditions? Or might there also be qualitative questions about how to conceive of the universal itself? In specific, whether humanity, towards the end of your talk, is actually the right category as the trope of the universal. Why not, for instance, instead of we humans in building community and the possibility of critique, we creatures, or we animals, we earthlings, we cyborgs, we you can fill in the blank.
Zombies.
Yeah.
I'm only half facetious about that. I'm putting together a film festival 2 weeks from now. First one. I'm also now director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities at Penn State. And one of the things we're doing, sort of to raise the profile of the Institute, but also to raise precisely the question you raised, but to do it in a sort of arbitrary but fun way, is a film festival called Bad Futures, ranging from District 9, Children of Men, for comic relief, Sleeper, but also Code 46, Gattaca, what have you. Which means, by the way, that in order to show these 15 films over the course of 3 days, I've watched maybe 80 of them, so I'm in a really bad mood. And I also find it fascinating, though, that I can't think of a single major representation of the future that isn't dystopian, with the exception of Star Trek, which buys its optimism by way of that ellipsis. Well, there was a really dark period, but we got over that. And now we have an egalitarian society. We walked right up to the abyss and pulled back. I think that's one of the reasons Star Trek's so popular. And of course, Star Wars, completely different thing, completely fantasy universe, another galaxy long, long ago. But all the rest of our representations of the future, especially the near future, are pretty bad. It used to be nuclear annihilation. Now it's bioterror, deliberate or otherwise. It's ecological devastation. It's the slow bleed of the Gulf of Mexico, that sort of thing. So that's the reason I made the 2 gestures to expanding the idea of the universal beyond the scope of the human. It is not yet to the scope of the human. To answer your question more directly, B. Yes, it's just quantitative. Do we have a new universalism policy that includes 97% of humans? Just those 3% abject over there are not there yet. No, I don't mean that. I mean, that's actually the case, and it's also the reason for Eva Katay's and Martha Nussbaum's critique of Rawls. Social contract tradition would be in many ways great progressively if it were realized, but it would leave a residuum of the abject. It would always leave people out of the accounting, and not by accident, but by design. And if that's the case, it's not truly universal in a quantitative sense, but also will never get there qualitatively. It also is very badly designed, although this is, I refer you to the last part of Nussbaum's book, Frontiers of Justice, Disability, I'm going to forget the second term, and Species Membership. The question is how to think of those other species since they don't participate in forums like this. They may have the, dolphins may be going, at us. I'm being facetious about that, but every step we've taken over the last 50 years in researching animal cognition raises the bar. Like, oh, they could do that too. We have octopuses using tools. Really? That far down? Yeah, octopuses. Birds punishing social cheaters. Really, I mean, we're not yet there, to finding worms spelling out, Wordsworth poems on the sand. But I'm borrowing here actually from Alistair McIntyre's book, Dependent Rational Animals, in which he scores any number of philosophers for buying our species' uniqueness at a discount. He has, Heidegger distinguishing us from flatworms, fairly simple. But what if it were all our creatures? What if it were, sentient creatures, whatever that means, a nod to Peter Singer? What if it were creatures who could feel pain? What if it were the entire scope of things living? My point is simply that only the universal allows you to ask that question in the first place. If it were a question of go and exercise dominion over the land, these are all your beasts to do with as you will, there's no challenge to that. That is an explicitly hierarchical and exclusionary kind of dispensation. Whereas if you say, no, we had this idea that actually all X's within this boundary should be treated with dignity, whatever dignity means, and we'll keep revising that as well, then the category of what X, the meaning of what X is, qualitatively, is always open for debate. Now, will we have that debate in productive enough ways to stop ourselves from wiping out much of the planet? Hard to say. Come see the film festival.
Michael, thank you for your presentation. It was great. I'm an American Lit specialist and with a focus on Melville, and thank you for the Ahab reference.
Nobody gets the Type E reference.
Well, eventually, we'll get there. I basically want to focus a little bit of attention on digital scholarship. My interest in Melville got me into manuscripts. My interest in manuscripts got me into revision. And and that's how I got seduced into digital scholarship. The problem that I wanted to put before you, to hear your responses, is twofold. Number one, because digital scholarship is based on a major infrastructure, and that costs money, major institutions, research institutions, get all the bucks. Places like Hofstra have to struggle and struggle. And now we're seeing, I think, more and more institutions at Hofstra's size and budget are able to get programs going or building more infrastructure. And so number one, I was wondering if you had some thoughts about that. But number two, I also wanted to ask about the larger issues of universalism and digital scholarship. Is it possible for digital scholarship to enhance the discourse in ways that you were suggesting? The discourse in ways that you were suggesting, the discourse about universalism, the discourses about exclusion and inclusion that you've been talking about so well today.
Thanks so much for that question. I mean, as I said at the outset, the talk's a little light on the 21st century part. We did the last couple decades of the 20th century, and I did have a sort of phantom couple paragraphs in there about the place of digital humanities and digital scholarship, and decided it was too tangential, but I hope someone would bring it up. Okay, so yes. Is there let me take it backwards. Is there no, let me take it in the order, the question. First about infrastructure. Yeah. The people who imagine that the digital humanities or digital scholarship will be this frictionless universe always tend to gloss over the fact that sooner or later there's got to be actual computers to run these things and servers and stuff like that, and actual nuts and bolts, okay, silicon, infrastructure to support it all. And sure, that a place in the size and budget of Hofstra is going to be in a difficult economic place with regard to enormous research universities. Let me just say this about that. Places like Hofstra are already in precarious positions with regard to the old system of scholarly communication. One of the reasons we have a crisis of monograph in the humanities, mainly in English and the modern languages, because philosophy has moved away from the monograph, history is still straddling the fence, but it's pretty much the modern languages still hanging on to it. Well, it used to be that you could publish a book in the modern languages and it would sell automatically 600, 800 copies to university libraries. University libraries' buy lists are now down drastically. So now those new books come out and they sell about 50 hardcover copies. Director of the University Press of Illinois told me it couldn't cost more per unit if we were hand illuminating them and stitching them. Right? So, that whole system, it used to be the MLA, and I was around the table when they did it, and then I participated in this task force on the evaluation of scholarship and the crisis of the monograph and so forth. The MLA did this sort of temporizing thing of saying, well, if an institution demands the production of monographs, then they should support it with either subventions or research accounts, what have you, which simply distributes the subsidy elsewhere. It used to be that your scholarship in the humanities was basically subsidized by university presses and university libraries. There was never really a huge market for French medieval works on Yvan. I hate to say it, but it's true. And it wasn't so much the queer stuff and the trendy stuff and what have you. It was always the stuff that was never going to find a readership outside a small circle of specialists. That was always the stuff that was threatening to die on the vine, and now may just go. So in that economy, if we went on with that unsustainable model, Hofstra would be no better off. Right? It would really be down to a handful of fairly well-endowed university libraries and the few remaining functioning university presses that weren't surviving on regional cookbooks. That's what that economy looks. So my first thing is digital scholarship can't do worse. And in fact, may be more democratically available in scholarly terms than the system we're working with now. Having said that, I don't mean to dodge the question of who's actually going to run these things. And one of the things I'm supposed to be doing with my spare time is coming up with an answer to a challenge posed by James Heffernan at Dartmouth to create a sort of online portal for book reviewing. And it's a controversial proposal, I learned, among the DH people, the digital humanities people, because on the one hand, it's an enormous amount of unpaid labor. Book reviewing is even worse state than book production in the humanities. It's a scandal as far as I'm concerned. And so whenever I review books now, I ask to do it in venues where I can write 3,000-word review essays, because the very few places that publish these 200 words, I liked it, it was better than cats, kind of reviews, not really doing anybody any scholarly service, right? And the question of how to set up a portal like that, and then to do it in order to support the dying monograph, it's much trickier than it sounds. One other thing, though. I came around recently. The story of last year's MLA was the story of Brian Croxall's paper. That's because he couldn't make it to the MLA. Instead, he posted it to his blog and tweeted it in real time when he would have delivered it. And it was largely a paper about being an adjunct and the economics of being an adjunct. And it raised, I mean, one of the reasons it went around like wildfire is A, it was on Twitter, B, it raised all these questions about how we can imagine scholarly models of communication that don't depend on the dang conference. More people heard and read Croxall's paper, thanks to that Twitter feed, than would ever have heard it in MeetSpace. Sorry, I use that term. But yes, MeetSpace. And I came around. I used to think that Twitter was the death of Western civilization. I thought, Pac-Man didn't do it, Grand Theft Auto didn't do it, but Twitter, this is it. We're done. And when Rosemary Fayal, the executive director of the MLA, tweeted the 2008 MLA, I thought, oh, gimmick, place. And then I realized, and also what else I know about Twitter is, Newt Gingrich, I'm eating a donut right now. It's a free market donut, So I didn't see much point to it. But then I realized you can embed tiny URLs in Twitter. You can link to an architecture of much more substantial scholarly work. Now, my own blog, which is not all that substantial, I pay someone a couple bucks a month, and I have my own server and so forth and so on. It's a completely ad hoc kind of thing. But I do think one way or another, digital scholarly communication will be largely, if not wholly, digital before we know it. And coming up with a way to make that, keep the system of peer review in place, to make sure that system is democratic and as open access as possible, and is doing things with Creative Commons license whenever possible, that'd be, I have some hope on that front, qualified by all the qualifications that I used to get to that hope. Yeah.
I would like to ask a question and kind of thank you for an enlightening lecture. I speak as a scientist, and I've been working at this university for 10 years, and only at this audience I can admit I was wondering what the hell liberal arts is. I didn't know. And this 75th university celebration actually made me understand what is it all about. So there is no question as a scientist and as a mother and having children, went to college with loans, I don't have a question that there is no other type of education, that this is the core of any education. But yet we have this backlash against liberal arts education, and my question to you is, do you believe the liberal arts education, the way kind of you present it, is centered in the humanities and the arts, traditionally as understood, is sufficient? And to give you a kind of funny story that is my life, at Dean's Council, I remember one of the chairs of the humanities expressing how important liberal arts is because very successful graduate of their program is doing some financial modeling on Wall Street. He's very successful in everything. I think liberal arts is indispensable, but do you believe that it will be sufficient? Is it the end, in a sense, that you don't need something more in addition to augment it? And technology has moved humans forward, so you kind of cannot leave this thing hanging there as a third wheel, in my opinion, and I would like your response.
Well, I believe in the response this afternoon is that Tom raised the example of Hank Paulson as a really spectacularly successful kind of person. His degree, as I said, was in English. Yeah, he's ours. And it's every once in a while tempting, and I don't feel this temptation too strongly, but I know what it feels like, to say liberal arts are valuable because you come out as a pretty, if you really take this stuff seriously, not only do you wind up with a life where you're passionate about ideas and you're interested in any number of variety of things that make life worth living, but you can also be pretty clever and make a ton of dough. And let's put it this way. Let me skip ahead 2 steps in the argument. Penn State is a public university that now receives about 8 or 9% of its funding from the state. It's almost like a university that happens to be located in Pennsylvania. And Graham Spanier, the president, told me some years ago, every year when he has to go through the song and dance down in Harrisburg and be put through his paces, the temptation is overwhelming to say, screw it. We are talking about $300 million in a budget of $3.5 billion. We'll find it someplace. We will go around to those donors, those alumni who made it possible for us to finally cut free from the state and fund things. And that is the wave of the future. That's yet another bad future. There is no coming renaissance of public education. Not on the K-12 level, where now the attack is on teachers. That's the problem, is the teachers. We need to fire them. And also their pensions, that's also a drag. College teachers, forget it. The idea that in the crisis of the states, and we're in crisis 1. When the stimulus money recedes and disappears, all the people who complain about the stimulus will be complaining that they don't have it. It'll be Tea Party 2. And I just don't see that with all the other things, with infrastructure, with health needs, with all those other things, the university is going to go back, public university is going to go back and say, no, we really need an upgrade in the library, either for infrastructure or for French medieval. That day is not going to come. And so I do feel a little protective about the donors who could possibly bail us out of that era. I think we're going back to the realm of the Medici is what I think. And if I, as an institute director, have to go meet with Lorenzo, I'll be happy to do it. Right? If he commissions a new thing for the side of my building, that's fine. Having said that, of course, it's not sufficient. Right? One of the questions you raise, I think we'll take this up this afternoon, is not only what the function of the liberal arts is, quite apart from leading the examined life, but one of the things that got left out, because it depends again on how your campus is configured. I said very little about the fine and performing arts. Once I became a director of the Humanities program at Illinois, I used to go around to other campuses and say, take me to your art history department. That will tell me everything. Because where you put art history suggests a lot of how you've organized yourself intellectually. By that I mean, how weird is it, to put this another way, that English on the organizational chart is so remote from theater? I mean, I had to get through like 3 security clearances just to get over to theater. Right? Different college, different language, different whole, right? Whereas I'm really close to biochemistry. How did that happen? You take any artist and humanist up to, say, 1850. You take Kant, you take Plato, you take Da Vinci, and show them the arrangement we have for the divvying up of the arts and humanities. It would make no sense whatsoever to them. And the reason I raise that is that as much trouble as we have defending the humanities and the liberal arts in times of austerity, the arts, can you imagine? No, really, jazz has a utility. So does flamenco. And the reason you should consider sculpture is they don't want any part of this language whatsoever. Right? So it makes the same, it poses the same kinds of problems, only a fortiori, and they don't get to say, well, at least Bérubé said this stuff about universalism and excluding the excluders and how to come up with a tolerant society that includes intolerant people. I do solo trumpet. Right? And that's also not going to be digital anytime soon either. What is going to be the fate of studio classes in the performing arts? And I think unless we get over this divide, this division of labor, where the artists over here, they have Center for Performing Arts, the humanists are over here, and they have research in the humanities. Unless we find some way of bridging that, we're in trouble. I say that with a smile.
Dr. Bérubé, I actually found many of your comments on the purpose of the humanities, and in particular defending the humanities by acknowledging that the role of liberal arts is a critique of common sense and not a kind of reaffirmation of common sense to be tremendously valuable. But my question has to do, again, to go back to the question, to how you framed the debate over universalism. And I became a little wary of your marking of Zizek's position as totalitarian, which is more a rhetorical marking than a theoretical critique. And I think perhaps that also can be seen to extend to seeing anyone who disagrees with Habermas as basically saying, you know, we can't communicate. Right. So my question is, regarding the universal, if any radical alternative is marked as totalitarian and accepted as such, isn't that in part the work of common sense? And shouldn't we be questioning that work, particularly at a time when the issue is not simply that marked by the, you know, the horizon, in terms of the horizon marked by the Enlightenment, which is the question of political equality, but the question that is increasingly being posed today, which is one of economic equality and you know, the question of capitalism and the changes that it's undergoing at the moment?
Short answer is yes, but let me give you the long answer. Roping off Zizek or anyone else and saying this is radical and would lead to totalitarianism and therefore must be excluded is precisely the kind of liberal exclusionary move that critics of the Enlightenment are critiquing. So that impasse you describe, I think, is real. I was trying to hedge on this. I didn't say Zizek, you know, supports totalitarianism. I think he's much slipperier than that and also kind of funny. What I said was his support of radicalism and what many people would call totalitarianism, and I was trying to allude to the title of his book, Did Somebody Say Totalitarianism? Which kind of grew out of this exchange with Laclau. Because the idea was, okay, well, you have this critique of liberalism, democracy, what have you. One of the things Laclau pointed out, but you ran for office. You were basically a liberal Democrat on the campaign trail. What exactly, you know, radical society do you want to see? And my critique of him, Zizek, is that he deliberately didn't have an answer to that. It's elsewhere. It's other than. It is the alternative. It is that which is not imaginable. Now, if you don't have something like that which is not imaginable, you don't have utopia. If you don't have any dreams from that's why I resonate to defenses of the avant-garde. Who else is going to imagine another world? Hank Paulson? All right. And I think the move to cast Zizek as, you know, therefore totalitarian is a suspect move, but it's one he likes to play with. You don't know exactly how serious he is, you know, about calling for basically, you know, revival of some of the most sordid forms of totalitarianism. I don't think he means it seriously, but let's just say he enjoys being the gadfly, you know, poking the holes in that sort of, you know, liberal consensus that now we know liberal democracy is the only way to go. Let me say something else about that. The real trouble, right, for that sort of political theory over the last 30 years is not what about these wild-eyed radicals with their incomprehensible jargon and radical schemes for, you know, coming up with utopia. The real problem has been the kind of reign of scorched earth neoliberalism that gave us the financial crisis of 2008, and it gave us the Deepwater Horizon disaster. You know, Zizek did not do anything bad in the Gulf, right? For that matter, neither did Chomsky, a man I criticized throughout the left at war. Like, there's a whole argument to be made that the shortening of horizons, the constriction of the imaginable over the past 30 years is precisely the crisis. So I resonate in sympathy with the argument, and I just think that in the end, though, seeing the entire enterprise, root and branch, as something that must be rejected, seeing that project of modernity as something that's got to be scrapped from the ground up. Why do I feel that that shouldn't be scrapped from the ground up, whereas I do feel that about the social contract tradition, which is sort of bound with it in some ways? Because precisely, to go back to the point I made earlier, you can always challenge the universal. Now, again, some of its defenders, like Habermas, don't always do it the way I'd prefer them to do it. But you can always say, your account of the universal leaves out these alternatives, leaves out this possibility. And only the universal is open to challenge in that way. So in the end, point taken, and yet I'm not going fully down that road.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and I've already recognized it.
This is, I guess, a slightly broader kind of question. You've been speaking as if the crisis is essentially unique to the American experience, when in fact the challenge to the liberal arts is far broader than that. If you look at the critiques that have been made recently, let's say of the English university system, where in fact if you cannot prove that what you do has an ultimate social utility, your department is likely to disappear. And what happens when we get to the point that philosophy departments disappear, language departments disappear, because in fact they don't have the social utility that institutional life has begun to demand of us. The crisis, it seems to me, is much broader than the one that we are experiencing at our universities. It is universal? I'm sorry about that.
No. We're exceptional. Actually, the funny thing is that that's kind of true. For now, at least, that's still kind of true. What you say is entirely right. Outside the U.S., far, far worse. And in the U.K., if you're not in Oxbridge, you are subject to the worst kind of, bean counting, utilitarian nonsense. It's not only that you have to measure and assessment the impact of the scholar, but it has to be a sort of short-term, demonstrable, measurable social utility. So if I show up and say, well, actually, helps people, 30, 40 years down the road, think more complexly about things that need to be thought complexly about, no, that's not the answer they're looking for. And the evisceration of the university system, not just in the UK, but throughout Europe, is stunning. We're basically, to use an image I've used elsewhere in other contexts, think of what's the sustenance, the persistence of relatively inutile liberal arts in the U.S. as a bunch of folks with the fingerless gloves hovering over the oil can. It's really down to that kind of economy. That said, I just read. I toyed with the idea. Some folks from Warwick asked me to speak about what in the world we can say about the rhetoric of utility if we can't demonstrate impact, and citation index doesn't do it either. Not that who wants to leave this earth saying, well, I made a mark in the citation index, and that's not exactly the impact, right, that we're looking for. But I thought, well, let's take something difficult. Let's take something like the cochlear implant debate among the deaf. Let's take the competing imperatives on the one hand about the ambivalence about technology and the history of ambivalence about technology in the disability community, why that is well grounded, the history of the 100 years of oralism and the attempt to ban sign language, basically among all deaf communities, over against, on the other hand, some sort of mitigating effects of cochlear implants, the ethics over pediatric cochlear implants, Let's give that in essay form to freshmen. Then let's give it to them as seniors. Let's see if they get any better. Now you say, well, what do you mean? How do you measure that sort of thing? You go 12% more deep, 40% more complexity about ethics, and especially about pediatric cochlear implants. But actually, I just read this, people are actually devising a metric system like that. I'm kind of perversely entertained by this. I think it's not necessarily a bad idea. It's not quantitative. But it is like, they will say, value added, and it produces, I've seen this in other contexts, not with this exam, but what happens when you ask about what students learn in their 4 years, some odd things pop up. Namely, that the community colleges and the more comprehensive universities add more value than the Ivies do. The Ivies are already dealing with people who know how to make their way around an argument for the most part. They get 2% smarter, or more complex, or more ambivalent, or ambiguous, whatever, over the course of 4 years. Whereas students who have had no training whatsoever in how to argue two things at the same time, which is basically what you have to do with the cochlear implant debate. You have to. A friend of mine, in fact, a teacher at my high school, which was a Jesuit high school, says, I'm going to put a good word for casuistry. It's had a bad name for 400 years, but casuistry can really be useful. I'm going to make two competing arguments at the same time. I'm just going to let them collide. Now, that's not a bad thing to be able to do when you're dealing with something like not only cochlear implants, but all manner of decisions made on behalf of children or people who cannot make cognitively decisions about their own health for whatever reason. Now, I would like people to be able to think more subtly about that. If you can come up with a metric for that, I think that has social utility. I'm willing to play that game and see how it goes. But it's something that, obviously, throughout the UK, throughout Europe, I mean, I think they've just given up. It is simply, research dollars, immediate impact, bang for the buck. And we're actually now the exception, and we're doing away slowly with the very few things that make American universities attractive to foreign students. Makes no sense, but there it is.